How's it going?
Hey, good. How are you?
Not too bad.
Um, I want to talk super hypothetically about the single file editor and the Web IDE and what the future of coexistence or not coexistence looks like. Sort of given, I guess it was last week or the week before, when I pulled a bunch of data. And so maybe that's like the place to start. Let me.
I'll have this happen. Maybe. I have ideas.
You have ideas. Good. I'm really conflicted. I can preface this before we start looking at anything, that I'm really conflicted. When I started, I was told that like the goal was to get rid of the single file editor. Marcel went through a phase where like we weren't really sure that was the right answer because the workflows were like we want to do these quick things in the single file editor, like in CI, like that was the entry point and all these things. And so we were just sort of like, we really just want to standardize like the technology and like be able to do things in both places. And now I'm looking at data and like the single file editor has more usage for everything we care about than the Web IDE does. And like that's concerning now. Now I'm concerned that like all of the investment we're making isn't actually doing anything.
Right.
And that's where I think like the problem is. And so like I'll just quickly run through this. If you look at whoa, what's what I want to do? So if you look at like these two things, like these are hilariously different. Like the single file editor has, 4x total page use, the Web IDE, which is a lot. I mean, that's like a not insignificant difference. And this is GitLab.com data, so like take it with a grain of salt, but relatively good sample size.
Right.
Merge request is like almost 2x sort of across the board, which is people who go to a merge request from the single file editor. And so there's multiple ways that that could happen. Some of it could be like the Web IDE workflow is probably more likely that you use the Web IDE, click create new merge request, and you're directed and you're creating a new merge request. I'd imagine the single file editor workflow is much more like there's a merge request that already exists and you hit edit on a file, which uses the single file editor, and then you're directed back to the merge request when you save. So that's probably not quite the apple to apples comparison, but it is just like, it sort of shows that there's like a lot of single file editor usage like inside of merge requests. The other one is single file from merge request. So this is sort of mirrors this graph basically, which is how to basically draw that correlation that that's most of what's happening is people are going in a merge request, they're going to the single file editor. So the difference between these two would be the people who are actually creating merge request from the single file editor, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then like the last one is like a direct nav piece. Just because that's like an interesting thing that we've talked about with the Web IDE is being able to like directly navigate to the Web IDE. It's one of the reasons we want to support this like read-only mode where, or not even a read-only, like permissions at the end. So that way more people could do things like we do with the handbook where there's a Web IDE link on the page, and if you click that, it takes you directly into that page and you can start editing it, right? Like if we checked permissions on the backside of that, direct nav would be and then like direct nav for the single file editor is relatively low. So I guess that's good. But really like I think sort of the concern for me is like this page use pieces, which is like 3 or 4x. And I'll stop sharing. And I don't know what my answer is anymore. I think, like I said, if I had been asked months ago, I would have said, no, right now we just want to standardize on the technology and like we want to put all the great things we're doing in the Web IDE, we want to be possible in the single file editor. And now I'm wondering if maybe we should be more aggressive. And I guess there's two parts to that. One, I don't know if we have a discovery problem or if we have a usability problem. Like, I don't know what we have, right? Like, is it that people don't use the Web IDE because they don't know it exists? And like, if they knew it existed, they would use it because it is a better editing experience, and like all the rest of this would fall in line. So I don't know if we're trying to solve a discovery problem, or are we trying to solve I use the Web IDE and I hate it and I just want to keep using the single file editor problem, and like we have some different like fundamental usability problem with the Web IDE. And then that could be like performance. It could be that most people just want to like quickly make that change and commit it back, and like that is arguably significantly faster in the single file editor. And so I don't know if that's the thing we have. So I would say, what do I want to get out of this? One, I want to know, like, do we think there's some things we could do to try and like flip the scales on like this? I think discoverability is like an easy thing that we can play with without doing a bunch of research, right? Like we could tweak some buttons and do some other things to try and sort of generate feedback. So I think like that's a thing we should be thinking about. And then the other is like, is there a future state where only the Web IDE exists? And is that like a future state we want? Like, should we be thinking about how we're getting to that future state, or is that not the future state we want? Is sort of the other open-ended question I have. So that's my setting the stage, I guess, for all of this. And I'll like put these two questions in.
So I guess I should preface. It's one of my favorite things Sid said the other day, like in passing. I think it might have been in that video where you were talking about where he was getting the pizza. A little nugget he threw out there: strong opinions loosely held, right? So you're about to hear some strong opinions, but they're loosely held.
Yeah.
Because I don't have data, and I see Catherine has joined us, so even more so, like these should probably be valid. This guess should be validated with data, probably. But I think that what is happening here is it's just people like to do things right where they are, right? Like Gmail switched that mode to like creating a new thing, used to go to a new page. Now it pops up, right? That's been like the trend of things. People want to do things right where they are. I honestly think that is the driver of why people are seeing where we're seeing much more usage of the single file editor, right? Because it feels less like you're going to somewhere else. It still has the UI surrounding it that, you know, the rest of it does. So it feels quicker, regardless of whether it actually is or not. My belief is that it probably is perceived as quicker. I don't know how we would even test that to confirm that, but so when I think about it, like I almost think that we go the other direction, right? We play into that idea that the single file editor is for quick things and the Web IDE is for more advanced things. Like I would like to see when I click the edit button, like it doesn't go anywhere. It loads where that file was. You know, it's like when you're navigating through the regular tree thing, rather than that, even going to a different page, if we could replace the presentation of a file with a presentation of a file that lets you edit it, to me would be the ideal thing. Because I think that's what is driving is people just want to do things right here, right? If I'm going to use a single file editor, I'm going to change, oops, I forgot the period at the end of the sentence. I click it, I hit it, commit it, it's done, right? I never leave the screen. I think single file editor is about speed and Web IDE is about like an editing experience. So I don't know that it's necessarily a bad thing, right? That we're seeing much more usage of the single file editor. I think maybe we just need to, I guess, one, validate that my wild assumptions are true. But two, like play into them, right? If people want to do things fast, let's gear the single file editor to speed. or at least perceived speed. And the Web IDE is for more advanced things. And then if we want to talk really moonshotty things, like if I could wave my magic wand, to me there would be a world where like the line is very blurry, right? You start in the single file editor, continue in the Web IDE, and then like move to local if you had to, right? And your changes, not having to commit in between those things, like just your changes come with you, right? Like that, it's a seamless kind of transition between those three things.
When you say like the Web IDE is for advanced things, this is where I think like sort of begins, some of the struggle starts for me, right? Like one of the things we're doing in 13.1 is editor config, right? Like we're gonna, if you load the Web IDE, it'll now support an editor config file if you have one in your repository. And so we'll like enforce tab size and spaces and all these other things that like you might configure. The question is, like that's valuable, right? No matter what the editing experience is. Because if you're in the single file editor, like it'd probably be helpful to like have all those things natively enforced for you too. And we could, but that's like furthers the burden of like furthers the like, oh well, why would I use the Web IDE? Like I get the thing that I actually need out of that in my single file editor, right? Like, and I get what I'm trying to. Linting's the next one, right? We're going to do CI linting in 13.2. I think Himanshu's going to pick that up. And if I look at that, right, initially we're going to put that in the Web IDE because that makes sense. Could very easily put it in the single file editor. And when you're editing like GitLab CI file in the single file editor mode, like you'd get those linting capabilities. And I guess I struggle with like, do we want to build really good experiences like that in the single file editor, or is holding those out of the single file editor and driving those people to like the Web IDE to get those features like the right way to move those people, I guess, right? Is that like, do we want those things to be, which I would say are advanced for, given the history of the Web IDE, do we want those things to be Web IDE exclusive experiences, or do we want those to be like editing experiences? And like, how are we going to rationalize like what goes where in the future?
Yeah, to me, I think like give the people what they want, right? Like, and if the data is showing that they're using the single file editor more, that to me, like, I don't know that we should, other than like making our numbers look good, but that's a silly thing, right? I don't think that'll ever be our driver here. I mean, not
Sort of is.
really, right? But I mean,
It sort of is
trying
how
to
we
make
justify like how the group exists.
Yes. But at the end of the day, we're trying to make a product for people, right? Like, and if they would rather do it here, it seems silly to me to like push them to the Web IDE if we could just make the single file editor in place better, right? I guess I kind of look at it like, should we have the Web IDE or the single file editor? I think we just have the Web IDE, but with the ability to turn the sidebar off. And then we embed that in the single file, every place that the single file editor is, right?
Right. Which is what we're doing, essentially.
And then obviously it's more than just the sidebar, right? But I think that's an easy example of, like, if you had all the power of the Web IDE in the single file editor in place, and then like go full screen on it, right? I think makes more sense than like go to Web IDE. Like, I'm already editing, I'm just like, I want to see the extra features because I'm doing something that needs the extra features. To me is a more natural kind of like, it's an artificial split that has happened right now. I don't think it needs to be. I mean, obviously there's some technology barriers and it's not easy to accomplish any of this stuff. But from an experience standpoint, I don't think that we'd ever not want to have anything, you know, tabs, linting, any of that not available in the single file editor if it was possible. Unless it came at the cost of like huge performance hits.
Right. How do you think about like, so let's take like the single file editor, and I'm gonna do this because I think let's go find a file. Hang on one second. Okay. So, oh, good. I put an image. This will make this much better to edit.
Yeah.
So like this is the single file editor, right? And this hasn't been switched over to Monaco yet. I think it will be soon. Is there a concern about some of this, right? Like we've spent a lot of time working on like how we think about commit messages, how we look at like branches and where you can commit and how you create merge requests, and like making sure that like some of that is a lot better, and like that experience is not at parity in the single file editor, right? Like this is like the most hilarious thing ever, right? We don't actually say that you can do anything here. We default this to master, but if I change this to like create, I suddenly get this like new sort of hidden UI paradigm that like this change will start MR because I knew to change this, but like that stuff's not obvious. And so like some of this, like that we are enforcing good workflow practices in the Web IDE, right? Like we've worked really hard to like sort of force workflows through merge request and through all these other features because we want that to happen. The single file editor doesn't do, and it's like a different experience altogether. I wonder, like, we could get editing parity. Does that mean we also then need to like start thinking about getting like workflow parity into this as well? Like, is that a concern that like, because this is so different, it doesn't work the same way that like, I don't know, that's like this additional level of like effort and work that we have to put into it versus if we just killed it completely and we're like, oh, everything's in the Web IDE now. Like,
Yeah.
We don't have to do that. We don't have to try and maintain like these two separate experiences with two separate workflows, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think the single file editor would probably be a slightly pared down version of that, right? Like, maybe not though. Maybe you will always want to. The single file editor seems like master or whatever branch you're in or whatever context you were in when you started it in is probably the one you want to stay in, right? Less likely so than in the Web IDE where you might want to fork this and create a patch and all that stuff. But I don't know. Yeah, it is a good point, and it would be a lot to have to maintain that flow. But maybe not. Maybe we change the flow so it works in both.
Okay.
Real quick. Yeah, I look at this file, right, where we're like, there's so much of me that wants me to just be able to say, like, wait, why do I need to leave this page and go to this? And this is so close. to it just needs a commit button and a flow to commit that right here, right? Like a drop down that lets me commit. That's where it's kind of tough for me to say, like, let's bust them out of this world here and force them into the Web IDE, because I lose all context of everything that I've been in, right? It's that whole, like, the more you change, the more jarring it will always be to a user, because they have to like reorient themselves as to what just happened and where they are and what happens now. So the more you can do it in the context, if this edit button just like popped up an area here that allowed me to commit, or down here somewhere, right, that allowed you to commit, the mental strain that I had to go through of what's happening is all I need to know is now I have the ability to save this, versus like going to a new page like we do now, or going to a completely different UI experience, which the Web IDE does. So it's, I don't know, I guess we probably should figure out a way to do some research around this, right? Because our lives and our engineers' lives get a lot easier if we could kill this and go to the Web IDE, right? There's huge benefits of, I don't have to design as much, engineers don't have to build as much, right? We build like our focus just sits solely on the Web IDE. So there's so much benefits to that. I don't, my gut feeling is that that's never going to fly. I feel like that will degrade our experience because of what I just said. People want to stay in the context that they're in. But it sounds like an important enough topic that like we shouldn't let Mike's wild ideas and harebrained thoughts drive decisions. We should see if we can't get some data to support that.
Yeah, I'll say the reason I sort of asked about those features earlier was one of the things that I had talked about when we talked about this was, he's like, well, if you put linting of CI files and you put editor config in the single file editor, he's like, you can't go to users now and be like, oh, we're getting rid of the single file editor because our engineers are lazy. Like, that's not an okay reason. But you could go and be like, hey, we're getting rid of the single file editor because we've built a really great editing experience that includes all these additional features in the Web IDE, and we think this is the best way to edit files.
Yeah.
Right. And so like, that's why I'm hesitant right now about like doing things in the single file editor, because the more we make the single file editor good, the harder it is to make a case to get rid of it, because now people are like, but it did everything I wanted it to do. And I guess I think that's sort of back to my like the usage questions is like, is it discoverability or usability, right? Like, I think broadly it's one of the two things. I think discoverability is fairly easy to experiment against without maybe some excessive research, although I mean, now that we've occupied all the time and Catherine has sat here and we've said the word research multiple times, maybe we could ask her, like, maybe there's ways to like research the discoverability thing and like just see like, hey, here's a project you need to make and like come up with like 5 edits you've got to do, and just see like the natural way that people do this, people who are familiar with GitLab, and like maybe they all use the single file editor and commit directly back to master, and like then we're like, oh, why did you do it that way versus why didn't you use the Web IDE? And they're like, oh, I didn't even know that was a thing. And then the other would be like, and I know Catherine linked the old research that had been done on this. Like, I don't know how to scope usability to something that's not just like so broad. Like, that would just, I don't think be very valuable. So
yeah, I think it's interesting. Like you said, discoverability is probably easier to test right away, which to me is like, you could answer the question of, okay, it wasn't discoverability, so there's something else there. And then you can follow up and find out what else is there. And I think what you said makes sense. I think you also mentioned a feature flag potential thing with like experimenting with the buttons. That's also an option. But yeah, you could also do it the way where you kind of, maybe you have some people doing a set of tasks on the current experience, so the way it currently looks, and you could also have a prototype for a group of people doing tasks with the Web IDE like highlighted, and kind of see how each group behaves based off of the prototype that they have. That's another way to do it. So yeah, the feature flag situation or like a usability testing scenario, I think both work. But yeah, I think that is one of the questions that might be good to start with, because I agree with Mike where without knowing whether people are intentionally choosing the ACE editor or the standard editor over the Web IDE, it is difficult to say like, yeah, is this a problem they're having? Or maybe this is just the workflow and the use cases that they think are good for the single file editor, and they don't even want to go into the Web IDE for any of that. So I think it is good to know whether, yeah, I'm aware of the Web IDE, but I still chose this editor. So that discoverability question, I think, is good.
Since we're almost out of time, I want to throw out a even crazier thought, just to like put it in your head and force you to think about it. 2 days from now, it'll sink in. It's just that this right here and navigating to files and then hitting the edit button is the worst file tree ever, that I believe was just designed this way out of convention because our predecessors did it that way, and they probably did it that way because of whatever, and I don't think it's ever been rethought. That this entire files thing doesn't make a lot of sense, and that honestly this whole thing could potentially be replaced with the Web IDE, right? Like, isn't the Web IDE a better file browser than our current file browsing? And
significantly more inefficient, but maybe.
And what makes that even worse is that the project overview and the files is the exact same. It's two of our top menu items here, and it's the exact same view almost, right? With the bulk of it is dominated by this file tree that is generally not how file trees are done anywhere else in the world, except for in Git type products. And it's why are we wasting two very top nav items on things like that? And maybe that's the problem, right? Maybe the problem is even one step above that, is that maybe the Web IDE would be more adopted if it was the file browser, and then you could jump into edit flows of it. Like I said, very wild, crazy idea, but that one came up the other day when I was talking to somebody else about something. Who knows, right? So I guess going back to bringing that back to the topic is are people using the single file editor? Because if you combine that file navigation system with the single file editor, it is a Web IDE. It's just not as good of one, but it's the one that you're presented with up front.
Yep. Be an interesting question for Pedro. I don't know if you ever
had
that conversation.
It actually came up yesterday. He was the person that I was talking to when this came up. So
what was his thought on it?
Well, we were doing the meeting was not that idea. But it was actually his idea that sparked my idea of that idea, was that we are underutilizing the onboarding experience is not great. When you first are dumped into a repository, you're just dropped into this thing with a bunch of Git commands, and like, should we possibly do the project overview could be a better page? Like, we assume that people want to edit files because that's generally what you do with Git. But if you created a repository simply to house the issues, then this page is very inefficient for that. So
Right.
there might be a world where, yeah, this is kind of a cross collaboration kind of thing. And there is more of a dashboardy kind of page. And who knows if we could then jump in there. But like I said, wild idea that's very much out there. But
do you meet as a UX team?
We do on Tuesdays.
Yesterdays. Would you mind like adding it to the agenda and just like seeing if you can? I'd be curious, like if you and Pedro and Marcel, who have like all spent sort of a lot of time, and then I think there's newer product designers that probably spend less time in like create, but I'd just be curious, like if you had that discussion as like a UX group, what your thoughts might be on it.
Yeah, it came up yesterday, and I definitely think it's worth getting more into it. So I'll throw that on the agenda for next week, and see if we can dive a little deeper on that.
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear what you think you can come back with. And then I think like just, I know we're well over, I think I like the idea of figuring out like, let's do some discoverability tests. And I sort of like Catherine sort of described, like maybe we just do the button change that we wanted to do, but maybe we find like 10 users on GitLab.com, toggle the feature flag on like a per user basis for like 5 of them, and give 5 people one workflow and 5 people the other, and like all that's different is sort of those 2 buttons, and see if they have like a natural tendency to just like click the blue one. If that like changes anything for them. I don't, it'll be hard to sort of find people, but maybe over the next couple of weeks we start writing up what that might look like. Maybe we can figure out like what would that look like, and what would we need to have in place to be able to do something that we can start. Maybe we could do like a controlled test of discoverability, and then I know we've got that other epic that's got like some ideas of things that we might change or tweak, and like maybe we just start trying to throw one of those in every few releases as well to try and just generate some feedback. I'll say that in my experience, the Web IDE has gotten, I want to say the Web IDE, maybe other features. We tend to have gotten really good feedback when we significantly broken things, more than we ever are able to get out of people for the Web IDE, because no one usually wants to talk about it. But when we like really break things, people like come and tell us that we really broke it. And so this might be a good way to like, maybe we just really break some workflows on GitLab.com, but we break them behind a feature flag so they're easy to like quickly unbreak, and see if we can like generate feedback. Even if we only did it for our own groups, because there was surprising amount of people who had code owners issues because they were using the single file editor when code owners was broken. That worked for GitLab, which was like mind blowing to me that all these people who like edit content in GitLab in the handbook on a regular basis like use the single file editor. And I don't know why. And I think like we just break their workflows and see what happens. And maybe I should go back and look for those people, and maybe we can just like, I'll try and set up some calls with those people and we just talk to them too.
Yeah. That's interesting. I didn't even realize that internally that's what you were seeing. But I think it makes sense, because I think it could be a bias thing. Like, you know, the Web IDE is weird and new and complex, and I'm just not even going to go there. I don't know. Because I know I've talked to a lot of people internally who it's been like, yeah, you know, I think I just want to get this done fast, or the Web IDE is nice, but I don't know what else is going on in this file tree and whatnot. So if it's internally, I think there is potentially more stuff around that, but we'll see.
I also kind of feel like a thing we could just survey, right? Like, do you use this or this? The explaining the this or this would be the hard part, because without skewing people's opinion. But like, you know, if we could figure out that problem, are you using the single file editor? Or are you using the Web IDE? Why? 2-question survey. Maybe not public, but internally might be an interesting spark a Slack debate kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the issue I have with like the discoverability one is like, feels hard to survey people on and be like, do you use the single file editor or the web IDE? People are gonna be like, I use both. It depends on 500 million variables that like I can't explain in these two checkboxes. And I
It's
think
also
that's where,
hard
like,
to ask if it's a discoverability problem. Do you use the web ID? What's the web ID? And then you explain it, and then like the discoverability of it is blown, right? Like,
yeah.
can't ask you about something that you don't know about without telling you about it.
Well, and that's the other thing. I think people call internally even, which is like also frustrating and like feels like there's some other problem here, is that the release post for 13.0, Farnoosh, who's like the product operations person, she created the merge request. And she's like, I did it in the Web IDE and it let me put a space at the end of the file name. And like that broke all the pipelines. I was like, and I tested for days, like trying to reproduce this. I'm like, it is literally not possible. I went and found the code like in our thing where like we trimmed the file name, blah, blah, blah. And she's like, no, I did it in the Web IDE. And then 13.1 comes around, she creates the release post again. And she's like, see, it was a problem again. And like the tech writer creates a screenshot and it's a screenshot of a single file editor. And I'm like, whoa, that's not the Web IDE. So like, this is why I couldn't reproduce what you're talking about. And so like, even internally, like people don't even know what they're talking about, I think, half the time. And like, I don't know if that's like a source. People might think they use the Web IDE and what they actually use is the single file editor all the time.
Yeah.
Or they might think they're the same thing.
Well, even yesterday on the Twitter thing about the autocomplete, that is the editor for snippets is where that happens. The markdown stuff is fixed in the Web IDE.
I could reproduce it in the Web IDE with a markdown file though.
Really?
Yeah, which is why I was like, yeah, it worked for me with markdown. But I think it might be that you have to save and commit the file, and then the Web IDE needs to reload the context of it being marked down because it doesn't get real-time updates on file type like the snippets editor does. Different problem, but I don't know. Yeah, because I just like Himanshu, like when we first started talking, was like, but it's fixed in the Web IDE, and I was like, worked for me in the Web IDE that autocomplete showed up, so I need to play with it again. And I knew that one with snippets. But yeah, I think like sort of a problem that like we've got these. It'd be good when we get everything on Monaco. We just need to figure out like what needs to be consistent about Monaco and what doesn't. So
yeah.
Okay, well, I think like the easy next steps are like I'll try and set up some people actually with the code owners thing, see if we can talk to them about the editors in general, and then if you can take that other conversation just to create UX group, I'm curious what they think, and maybe even take this conversation as well. Like, here's kind of the things we're struggling with. I'd be curious to get like a broader set of feedback, and then think about these things, and then we'll get through the next set of. We need to start looking at that discoverability stuff, picking one or two of those easy issues, and then figuring out how maybe we can do a usability test there. I think Catherine's right. The first thing is like we could easily rule out or in discoverability as the problem, and then like know how much of a mountain we've got to get through to like get through usability, or it's like, oh, it's purely a discoverability thing, and then like let's make some changes to like sort of address that.
Yeah, because I think if people are intentionally using that single file editor for whatever purposes, then it reminds me of this conversation about the milestones, like the group milestones page or something. Like they were saying you have to replace this with the same feeling before you deprecate it. So it becomes that kind of situation. But if they just didn't know about the Web IDE, then it's like, okay, great. Here it is.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks for the good conversation. I think
You're welcome.
I don't think we'll solve this soon, but I think it's something we've got to I don't know, maybe get a stronger opinion that's less loosely held at some point on it.
Yes. Exactly.
All right. Thanks everyone. Have a good day. Enjoy the rest of your week. Enjoy the long weekend.
Thank you. Bye.